Sir Pianist showed up 2 hours late. Frank Sinatra said 3 words that ended his career. The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. March 15th, 1961. The showroom was electric. 200 people packed into red velvet seats, cigarette smoke curling toward the chandeliers, champagne flowing, laughter echoing off the walls. This was opening night of Frank Sinatra's spring residency, the most anticipated show in Vegas. Every seat sold out weeks in advance, every table reserved for high rollers, celebrities, and people who mattered. The band was ready, 13 musicians in their positions, charts laid out perfectly, instruments tuned. They'd been rehearsing for 2 weeks, every arrangement memorized, every cue practiced, every transition smooth as silk. This was the best money could buy. The tightest band in Vegas. Professionals who understood that working with Frank Sinatra meant excellence. Not good, not great, excellence. At 8:45 p.m., Frank walked into his dressing room. Opening in 15 minutes. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of Jack Daniels, and reviewed the set list one more time. This was his ritual. These quiet moments before the curtain, when he could center himself, focus, prepare to give 200 people the performance of their lives. His musical director, Bill Miller, knocked and entered. Frank looked up. Something was wrong. He could see it in Bill's face. Bill explained the problem. Michael Corvino, the pianist Frank had hired specifically for this residency, hadn't arrived. His piano sat empty, his chair vacant. Bill had tried calling his room repeatedly. No answer. Michael Corvino, a phenomenal talent, classically trained at Juilliard. Perfect touch, perfect feel. Frank had heard him play at a club in New York 6 months earlier and had been impressed enough to offer him the job. Good money, prestigious gig, a chance to play with Frank Sinatra in Vegas, the kind of opportunity that launched careers. Frank looked at his watch. 8:47 p.m., 13 minutes until showtime. Bill admitted that Michael had also missed the afternoon rehearsal. Some of the band members had seen him in the casino around 3 a.m. the previous night. Still gambling, still drinking, still living like he had all the time in the world. Frank's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. He told Bill to try the room again. Send someone to physically knock on the door. They were going on in 13 minutes, with or without a piano player. Bill left. Frank stood up and walked to the window. He could see the strip stretching into the desert night, neon signs blazing, cars streaming past, thousands of people coming to Vegas to have the time of their lives. And right now, in his showroom, 200 of them were waiting for him. Waiting for the show they'd paid good money to see. The show they'd traveled for, planned for, anticipated. And somewhere in this hotel, a pianist was doing what? Sleeping? Still gambling? Hungover? Frank didn't know. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was about to go on stage without his piano player. At 8:52 p.m., Bill returned, shaking his head. Security had opened Michael's door. He wasn't there. The bed hadn't been slept in. Michael Corvino had simply vanished. Frank nodded slowly. His face was completely neutral. He asked Bill if he could cover the piano parts. Bill explained he could handle the basics, but Michael had specific arrangements. Complex parts Bill didn't know cold. Frank told him to do what he could. They'd adjust. They'd make it work. At 9:00 p.m. sharp, the lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. The band began the opening number. Frank walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. If anyone noticed the piano chair was empty, they didn't show it. Frank was there. That's all that mattered. For the next 90 minutes, Frank was magnificent. He sang every song perfectly, told jokes, worked the crowd. Made it look effortless, but the musicians knew. They knew certain arrangements were missing depth, certain transitions were rougher than rehearsed, certain moments that should have soared merely floated. Frank knew too. He could hear the holes where Michael's piano should have been, the missing colors, the absent textures. This wasn't the show he'd planned. It was good, but it wasn't what he'd promised himself, what he'd promised the audience. At 10:32 p.m., halfway through One for My Baby, Frank saw movement at the side of the stage, a figure stumbling slightly. Michael Corvino finally arrived, still in yesterday's clothes, hair disheveled, eyes red. reeking of alcohol and cigarettes and the stale air of a casino at dawn. He was trying to make his way to the piano, apparently thinking he could just slip in and start playing mid-show, as if nothing had happened, as if 200 people hadn't been watching a show without him for the past 90 minutes. Frank saw him. The band saw him. Some of the audience saw him. Frank didn't break character, didn't stop singing. But his eyes followed Michael as the pianist fumbled his way to his chair, sat down heavily, and put his hands on the keys with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to appear drunk. Frank finished the song. The audience applauded. Then Frank walked over to the piano. Slowly, deliberately, he stood there looking down at Michael. The showroom went very quiet. People sensed something was happening, something real, something that wasn't part of the carefully choreographed evening they'd expected. Frank asked Michael what time the show had started. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. But something underneath made the question sound like an indictment. Michael looked up, confused. He stammered that he was there now. He could play. Everything would be fine. Frank repeated the question. What time had the show started? Each word was precise, measured, final. Michael admitted the show had begun at 9. He tried to explain, but Frank cut through the excuses with another question. What time was it now? Michael glanced at his watch. 10:33. Frank did the math aloud. An hour and 33 minutes late. He asked where Michael had been. The question hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, inescapable. Michael opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The explanation tumbled out. A poker game, high stakes. He'd thought it would just be a couple of hours, but it went all night. And then he'd fallen asleep, and then he'd woken up and rushed over as fast as he could. Frank listened to all of this. His face was completely neutral. Not angry, not disappointed. Just attentive. When Michael finished his explanation, Frank summarized it back to him. Michael had fallen asleep while 200 people were waiting for the show they'd paid to see, while 12 other musicians were here on time, ready to work, while Frank was on stage performing without the piano player he'd hired, performing a show that wasn't complete because Michael had been playing poker. The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't part of the show. This was something else, something raw and real and uncomfortable. Michael tried to justify himself. He explained that it had been a good game, really high stakes. He'd been winning. He'd just gotten caught up in it. These things happened. Surely Frank understood. Frank told Michael to stand up. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but something in it made Michael obey immediately. Michael stood, uncertain, frightened now, beginning to understand that this wasn't going to end the way he'd hoped. Frank looked at him, really looked at him. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, still controlled, but something in it made everyone in the room hold their breath. He told Michael that he'd hired him because of his talent, because he'd thought Michael was professional, because he'd believed Michael understood what it meant to work with him, what it meant to be part of something excellent, something that mattered. Frank paused. Let that sink in. Then he admitted he'd been wrong about Michael. Michael started to speak, started to defend himself, started to promise it would never happen again. Frank raised one hand, stopped him cold with a gesture. Frank explained that Michael had made a choice tonight. He'd chosen a poker game over his job. Over 200 people who'd paid good money to hear them perform. Over 12 musicians who'd been there on time. Over Frank himself. That choice told Frank everything he needed to know about who Michael was as a person. It told him that Michael didn't respect the work, didn't respect the audience, didn't respect himself. The words weren't harsh, they were simple, factual, devastating in their calm delivery. Michael's face was pale. He tried again to apologize, tried to promise he'd never make this mistake again. His voice was shaking now, desperate. Frank agreed with him. He told Michael he was right. He would never make this mistake again. Then came the 3 words, calm, final, absolute. You're fired. The showroom was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming. So quiet you could hear someone's champagne glass touching their table 3 rows back. So quiet that those 2 words seemed to echo forever. Michael stood there, swaying slightly. He tried to argue, tried to explain that Frank couldn't fire him in the middle of a residency, that they had a contract, that the show needed him. Frank's response was brief. He'd just fired him, past tense, already done. He turned to his stage manager, Paul, who was watching from the wings with an expression of shock and something like satisfaction. Frank told him to escort Michael out, pay him for the night, send him home. Then Frank turned back to Michael with final instructions. Don't come back, don't call, don't ask for a second chance. This was done. Paul appeared at Michael's side, gently but firmly took his arm. Michael looked around the showroom, looking for sympathy, for someone to intervene. For this to somehow not be happening, he found nothing. 200 faces stared back at him with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity to cold indifference. 75 crew members watched in silence. No one moved to help him. No one spoke up on his behalf. Michael was escorted off the stage. Through the wings, past the dressing rooms, out the back door into the Nevada night. Less than 2 minutes after arriving, he was gone. His career with Frank Sinatra over before it had really begun. Frank turned back to the audience. He apologized for the interruption, explained that sometimes you had to handle business when business needed handling. Then, he asked the band to start the next song. His voice was warm again, charming. The show went on. But something had changed in that room. The audience had just witnessed something rare and powerful. They'd seen Frank Sinatra draw a line, make a standard clear, demonstrate that talent without professionalism was worthless, that excuses didn't matter, that choices had consequences. After the show, Frank went back to his dressing room. Bill Miller came in to check on him, asked if he was okay. Frank poured himself another Jack Daniels and said he was fine, asked Bill if he could learn Michael's parts by tomorrow night. Bill said he'd work on it. They'd make it happen. Bill hesitated before leaving. He mentioned that maybe Frank had been a little harsh, that Michael was young, that everyone made mistakes. Maybe he deserved another chance. Frank's response was simple. He explained that this wasn't about being harsh, it was about respect. Michael had disrespected 200 people, had disrespected 12 musicians who'd done their jobs, had disrespected the music itself. That kind of disrespect didn't get second chances, not on Frank's stage. The next morning, the story was all over Vegas. Frank Sinatra had fired his piano player mid-show, right there on stage, in front of everyone. The details varied depending on who told it, but the core facts remained the same. Michael Corvino had shown up hours late, drunk, full of excuses. And Frank had ended his career with 3 words. Michael's agent tried to do damage control, called it a misunderstanding, a scheduling conflict. Creative differences, but too many people had been there. Too many people had seen what really happened. The truth was out there, and it was devastating. Other band leaders heard the story, other producers, other club owners. When Michael's name came up for future gigs, someone always asked the question, wasn't he the pianist who showed up drunk and late to Frank Sinatra's opening night? Wasn't he the one who got fired on stage? The answer was always yes, and that was always the end of the conversation. Within 6 months, Michael couldn't get hired anywhere in Vegas. Within a year, he couldn't get hired anywhere that mattered. He ended up playing piano bars in small towns, weddings, private parties. The big career he'd been building, the reputation he'd been creating, the opportunities that had been opening up, all of it gone. Destroyed in one night, because of one poker game, because of one terrible decision. Frank, meanwhile, found a new pianist within 48 hours, a consummate professional named Vincent Falcone, who showed up 30 minutes early to every rehearsal, knew every arrangement cold and never gave Frank a moment of concern. Vincent would play with Frank for the next 15 years, would become one of his most trusted musicians, would build a career that Michael could have had. Years later, in 1973, Frank was doing an interview for a music magazine. The interviewer asked about his reputation for being difficult, for having high standards, for firing people without warning. Frank's response was characteristically direct. He explained that he wasn't difficult, he just expected professionals to be professional. He talked about the Michael Corvino incident, though he didn't use Michael's name, just referred to him as a talented pianist who'd learned a hard lesson. The interviewer asked if Frank ever regretted firing him so publicly. If maybe a private conversation would have been better. If maybe the humiliation had been too much. Frank's answer was firm. He said he didn't regret it for a second. Explained that some lessons need to be public, that Michael hadn't just disrespected Frank privately. He disrespected 200 people publicly. The response needed to match the offense, but more than that, Frank said. It was about setting a standard, about making it clear to everyone who worked with him what was expected, about showing that talent didn't excuse unprofessionalism, that being good at your job wasn't enough. You had to show up, you had to be reliable, you had to respect the work and the people depending on you. The interviewer pushed back, asked if that wasn't a bit harsh, if people didn't deserve second chances, if mistakes weren't part of being human. Frank's response was measured. He said that everyone makes mistakes, everyone has bad days, everyone struggles sometimes, but there's a difference between a mistake and a choice. Michael didn't make a mistake, he made a choice. He chose to keep gambling when he should have been sleeping, chose to keep playing when he should have been preparing, chose his own entertainment over his professional responsibility. That wasn't a mistake, Frank said. That was character, and character doesn't change just because you get caught. The interviewer asked one final question. If Michael showed up today, sober and professional and asking for another chance, would Frank hire him? Frank thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. He explained that trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild, that he needed to know the people he worked with would be there, every time, no matter what. Michael had proven he couldn't be trusted, and in Frank's world, trust was everything. Michael Corvino died in 1989. He was 58 years old. The obituary in the Los Angeles Times was brief, mentioned his Juilliard training, his early promise, his technical skill. It made no mention of Frank Sinatra, no mention of the Sands Hotel, no mention of March 15, 1961. The defining moment of his career was reduced to silence in his own obituary. But musicians knew the story. It became a legend, a cautionary tale. The pianist who showed up late to Frank Sinatra's show, the man who thought his talent was enough, the career that ended with 3 words. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. His obituary ran on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. It talked about his music, his films, his legacy, his standards, his professionalism, his insistence on excellence from himself and everyone around him. And in the music community, people told stories about what it was like to work with Frank, about his expectations, his discipline, his refusal to accept anything less than complete commitment. And they always told the story of Michael Corvino. The pianist who learned too late that talent without professionalism is just potential wasted. The lesson of March 15, 1961 wasn't about being cruel. It wasn't about public humiliation. It wasn't even really about Michael Corvino. It was about respect. Respect for the audience who paid to be there. Respect for the musicians who showed up on time. Respect for the music itself. Respect for the commitment that excellence requires. Frank Sinatra understood something that Michael Corvino never learned. That talent is just the beginning. That skill is just the foundation. That what separates the professionals from the amateurs isn't ability, it's reliability. It's showing up. It's honoring your commitments even when it's inconvenient, even when you're tired, even when there's a really good poker game happening somewhere else. Michael Corvino was talented, maybe even brilliant, but he wasn't professional. And in Frank Sinatra's world, professionalism wasn't optional. It was everything. That's why 3 words were enough. You're fired. Because by the time Frank said them, they weren't a surprise. They weren't cruel. They were inevitable. They were the only possible response to someone who'd shown such complete disregard for everything Frank stood for. The story of the pianist who showed up late isn't really about lateness. It's about choices. It's about priorities. It's about understanding that when people depend on you, you don't get to let them down just because something more fun came along. Michael Corvino made his choice that night in the casino. He chose poker over responsibility. He chose his own entertainment over his professional obligations. He chose himself over everyone else. And Frank Sinatra made his choice on that stage. He chose standards over convenience. He chose respect over talent. He chose to draw a line and defend it, no matter the cost. One of those choices led to a legendary career, to respect and admiration that lasted generations, to a legacy that still inspires musicians today. The other choice led to 3 words, final and absolute, career-ending and defining. You're fired. That's the real lesson. Not about showing up on time, though that matters. Not about respecting Frank Sinatra, though that was wise, but about understanding that every choice you make is building something. Either building a reputation for reliability, for professionalism, for being someone people can count on, or building a reputation for excuses, for self-indulgence, for being someone who puts their own desires above their commitments. Michael Corvino built the wrong reputation, and it took just one night. Just one poker game. Just one terrible decision. Frank Sinatra built the right reputation. And it took a lifetime of moments like that night. Moments when he could have been lenient, could have been understanding, could have given second chances, but chose instead to hold the line, to maintain the standard, to make clear that some things matter more than talent or potential or second chances. March 15, 1961, the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. A pianist showed up late, and Frank Sinatra said 3 words that ended his career. But those 3 words weren't the real story. The real story was about everything that led to them, about a lifetime of choices, about what we value, about what we're willing to accept from others and from ourselves. That's the performance worth remembering, not the songs Frank sang that night, but the line he drew, the standard he set, the choice he made to value respect over convenience. That's Frank Sinatra's real legacy, not just the music, but the lesson, that excellence requires discipline, that professionalism matters, that when people depend on you, you show up, you do the work, you honor your commitments, or you face the consequences. 3 words. That's all it took. You're fired.